This poster is an image most Americans will instantly recognize. It's a 1917 recruitment poster for the US Army, and it shows Uncle Sam, the fictional character representing the United States, looking directly at you. He points his finger at you as if to compel you to do your patriotic duty and sign up for the army. This poster is designed to send a clear message and provoke a strong emotional response, like this example showing the enemy stabbing a Bible. It's propaganda, and it's using human psychology against you, exploiting the fear that the enemy threatens your way of life. And while this particular propaganda may not appeal to you today, modern day propaganda is more effective and less noticeable than these examples, and there's a good chance that you secretly love it. I promise I'll give you the tools to identify it and defend yourself from its influence, but first I need to gradually show you different works of propaganda to explain how it works. You'll get a taste of propaganda techniques used today and learn who might want to influence you and why. In the end, you'll understand the danger we're all in right now. So here are the rules for effective propaganda. Despite fears of brainwashing, in reality, propaganda needs to build upon an existing belief to be effective. It builds off things like your existing opinions, cultural values, and influence from your parents and peers. But that's why propaganda is so terrifying. It exploits our basic psychology to get us to buy into its message. During wartime, the aim of propaganda is clear, as you and likely everyone you know is involved in the war effort and want to contribute all you can to it. That's what made these propaganda posters from World War II effective in drawing up support for the war effort and especially discouraging certain behaviors like telling rumors and secrets or spreading diseases. And while this was certainly necessary for the war effort, posters like this one rely on the appeal to emotion. We're supposed to be shocked that an ordinary woman can cause death by gossiping. The anonymous woman could be anyone. The idea is to scare you into keeping quiet. This poster is a classic example of wartime propaganda, or the quote, ideas, facts, or allegations spread deliberately to further one's cause or to damage an opposing cause. During a full-blown war, when a country is fighting battles, propaganda is used to mobilize the population to produce the war effort. But without actual battles to fight, Cold War propaganda was focused on countering the enemy's message. Take a look at this American animated film from 1950, which warns about falling victim to communist propaganda. The main character is a car mechanic who listens to anti-capitalist radio and is then transported to a dystopian world where ants are living in communism. After experiencing the communist dystopia, he learns the moral of the story. Communism isn't as great as it sounds, the key message of the film. Many of these propaganda films were made during the 1950s, a time when Americans featured communist influence. The so-called Red Scare led to investigations like the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Hollywood Blacklist, which cost many suspected communists their jobs.
Join the Navy. Join the Navy.
They're recruiting people with subliminal messages.
Around this time, the term brainwashing became a word in English, reflecting this fear of manipulation by psychological warfare. It was this fear which drove the creation of this counter-propaganda in the first place. Propaganda also relies on variables like previous associations with symbols, which is likely why the sickle and hammer symbol of the term socialist have become untouchable in American politics. But even in peacetime, propaganda is everywhere.
Arby's, in response to the plant-based fake meat trend, is now developing a mock vegetable made of meat. The chain has unveiled this, the merit.
And sometimes it's a lot harder to spot than you think.
M&M's putting its woke spokes candies on hold.
Most of us are probably more influenced by political messages than we realize and are more susceptible to propaganda than we'd like. So, in our modern world, where we're constantly bombarded by information at a breakneck speed, how can you identify propaganda? Well, it's not an easy task, but let's start by taking a look at how propaganda works in authoritarian countries, because proven propaganda techniques from the past are still being used today in new ways. But more on that a bit later. However, it's also good to take a look at these posters because their arguments are more obvious. See, since totalitarian governments have a monopoly on information, there's no need to be subtle or secretive about political motives, and that's why it's such a good starting point to look at the techniques used in propaganda. These propaganda posters with bold images with political slogans were produced by totalitarian regimes like the Soviet Union or Maoist China, and they're probably what you think of when I say the word propaganda. In fact, during the Maoist era in China, the term propaganda didn't even have a negative connotation. Take a look at this Chinese poster from the 1960s. We see a formation of peasants lined up as far as the eye can see. Their outfits look like farmers, but they're grouped like soldiers. The text at the bottom means all the people are soldiers to defend the motherland. When you consider that most of China's population at the time was living in rural areas working in agriculture, and that China had just ended a civil war about a decade earlier, the message is clear. This was the time of China's Cultural Revolution, a political upheaval directed by Chairman Mao Zedong to return China to a more revolutionary form of communism. The idea of purging old ideas like capitalism and traditional Chinese culture was promoted in posters like this one from 1967, proclaiming, quote, "Scatter the old world, build a new world." These ideas were pushed by Chairman Mao, China's leader, who tried to apply his radical ideas to all of society. Like in other communist nations, Chinese propaganda created a cult of personality around Mao. Here, we can clearly see Mao's face radiating above the people like a god, with a poster proclaiming, "Chairman Mao is the red sun in our hearts." Another poster declares, "Long live Chairman Mao," reusing the phrase that was once used for China's emperors. According to Jason Stanley, author of How Propaganda Works, this is an example of flawed ideology, which he describes as a way of rationalizing undeserved privilege in society. And this is exploited by propaganda. In this case, he states that, quote, "Those who possess this flawed ideology would not see the clear contradiction between revolution and obedience to authority." If you thought that communist posters were what propaganda looks like, you'd be right. But the thing is, this isn't what propaganda looks like anymore. Unlike during wartime or in an authoritarian country, propaganda is more subtle in modern democracies, but it still relies on basic human psychology to influence your opinions. If we go back for a second to the time of ancient Greek philosopher Plato, one of my favorite philosophers actually, but anyway, we can see how propaganda ultimately led to the downfall of democracy in ancient Greece. Plato saw the fatal flaw of democracy as the ability of certain politicians to manipulate and win over voters with cleverly crafted arguments. These men were called demagogues, meaning a person who wins support by exciting the emotions of ordinary people rather than by having good or morally right ideas. Does this sound familiar? Well, if you recognize these qualities in modern day politicians, it's because these personality types occur in pretty much any society in human history. In autocratic regimes, demagogues have a particular ability to cause harm on a massive scale because of their endless power. Now, what is fascinating is that Chairman Mao's personality cult rose to a new level at the height of the Cultural Revolution in 1967 as the Red Guards, which are paramilitary groups of high school and university students indoctrined in Mao's ideology, quickly spread all over China. They attacked intellectuals, teachers, former landlords, and anyone deemed a rightist, forcing them to publicly admit to alleged crimes in a struggle session. The Red Guards also destroyed temples, old books, and art, and even attacked a cemetery and desecrated the corpses of a long-dead emperor. While we often associate propaganda with written words, this is an example of propaganda of the deed, a public act to influence others. The result of Mao's demagoguery was millions of deaths from the Cultural Revolution, plus an estimated 30 to 45 million deaths from his failed Great Leap Forward a decade earlier. But surely, in a democracy, there are limits on a demagogue's power, right? We've learned from this, right? Well, perhaps not, as much as we would hope at least. In his book, How Propaganda Works, author Jason Stanley says that a certain form of propaganda associated with demagogues poses an existential threat to liberal democracy, and he highlights this catch-22 of democracy. You need freedom of speech to have a democracy, but having freedom of speech means you can't can't ban propaganda. In today's hyper-connected world, we're bombarded with information so rapidly that it's hard to figure out what is true and what isn't. In response, our brains cope by filtering information in three ways: selective attention, selective perception, and selective recall. What that means is we only focus on a few sources and pay more attention to messages we agree with, while forgetting the rest. Naturally, the news media exploits our psychology in order to get more clicks, draw in more viewers, and ultimately make more money. You may have noticed that the news seems like it's always negative, and you're not wrong. There's a psychological explanation for that. On the one hand, journalists see negative stories as more newsworthy. On the other, our brains pay more attention to negative information because our ancestors needed to react quickly to danger in the wild. In their 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent, authors Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman talk about how large media companies are influenced by the wealthy and powerful, the government and advertisers, resulting in more reporting on certain topics while avoiding others altogether. The Fairness Doctrine, a US regulation that required news sources to report fairly on multiple viewpoints for controversial issues, ended around the same time that cable news channels were taking off. This allowed news mogul Rupert Murdoch to create Fox News as an explicitly conservative news network, using the slogan "fair and balanced," a slogan which implies that other news networks had a liberal bias. They quickly won over conservative viewers. Hyper-partisan news channels like Fox News and MSNBC attract viewers by telling them what they want to hear, exploiting their confirmation bias and cherry-picking facts to suit their narrative. According to a 2021 poll by Washington Post, Fox News is the second biggest source for political and government news for conservatives. Today, Fox News isn't just the most watched news channel in the US, it's the most watched channel on cable TV, period. And when it comes to traditional media, whether in print, on TV, or online, it's good to keep in mind that most have some sort of political viewpoint. Today, the way our bodies process information is increasingly being exploited in ways we may not recognize. But in the age of social media, even though the major platforms are concentrated in a few hands, there has been a massive democratization of viewpoints. Anyone is able to share their beliefs with the world. This can be good for society, but it also offers an opportunity for exploitation. In 2016, the Russian government undertook a massive disinformation campaign to influence the results of the US presidential election. The country essentially has an army of trolls working under its internet research agency who work to sow discontent and spread doubt about democratic systems in the US and European countries. This includes the creation and promotion of fabricated news stories, also known as fake news.
You are fake news.
As well as posting divisive comments on popular websites. Social media has given Russia new tools to spread its disinformation far and wide. In addition to their trolls, they have an army of bots that can retweet, upvote, and otherwise promote their disinformation. They also exploit the voices of so-called true believers, the people who believe in the underlying narrative, who willingly spread misinformation because they believe it to be true. Through disinformation efforts like buying political ads on Facebook, Russia pushed both liberal and conservative messages in 2016. Any viewpoint was fine as long as it was politically divisive. Beyond its foreign policy value, the Russian government also uses these resources against its own people to tamp down on dissent and free speech online. The goal of domestic disinformation campaigns is the same: make it so nobody knows what's true anymore. Given the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, Russia is now focusing its disinformation campaign on Europe, using a similar tactic to fake news websites in the US. They are creating websites with similar names to legitimate news agencies, hoping to dupe people into believing their propaganda. But whether you find disinformation on social media or through a website, you should watch out for logical fallacies. These sound like convincing arguments, but they lack evidence or use logical errors. These are the same types of arguments used by demagogues that philosophers like Plato and Aristotle tried to warn us about. So let's take a closer look. You're probably familiar with the slippery slope hypothesis. This logical fallacy argues that if we allow one thing to happen, it will lead to an extreme and undesirable outcome. For example, before same-sex marriage was legalized in the United States, many conservative politicians argued that if we allowed two people of the same sex to marry, then we would end up allowing people to marry animals. Well, it's been almost a decade since same-sex marriage was legalized in the United States, and nothing remotely close to this has happened. Another logical fallacy is an attack on someone's character, sometimes referred to by the Latin name for it ad hominem. You see these a lot in political attack ads, where one politician argues that you should vote for them because their opponent is dishonest, corrupt, or otherwise a bad person. To give an example, here is a tweet by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez attacking Lauren Boebert, who was running for Congress at the time. For context, Ocasio-Cortez is a Democratic representative for New York, and Boebert is now a Republican representative for Colorado. In the tweet, Ocasio-Cortez attacks Boebert as being corrupt and, quote, too scared to hold regular town halls open to all. This tweet is a classic ad hominem attack on Boebert's character. Another commonly used argument is the strawman argument, where you oversimplify the opposing view and then attack it. A great example is this tweet by conservative activist Brigitte Gabriel, asking why does the left hate masculine men so much? She makes huge generalizations, lumping everyone on the left as having the same opinion, and then adds the assumptions that they all hate masculine men. There are way too many logical fallacies to cover in one video, so I'll just mention one more: the red herring. An example of this is the argument that coal may be harmful for the planet, but banning coal will make the miners jobless. The argument shifts your attention from the problem of coal pollution and shifts the discussion to jobs. Beyond your existing beliefs, threats like violence or losing one's job also have an impact on how propaganda is received. Another thing to remember about propaganda is that the claims it makes aren't necessarily false. To take the American anti-communist propaganda as an example, it's certainly true that Americans had more political freedom at that time than people in the Soviet Union, but the propaganda also relies on a flawed ideology, the idea that Americans are free, while ignoring the fact that, at that time, many Americans had limited freedom thanks to segregation. Disinformation and propaganda rely on our biases and existing beliefs, attempting to spark an emotional response and blind the logical part of our brain. It doesn't have to be negative emotion either, as patriotism is often used in propaganda to spark a positive emotional response. As Jason Stanley puts it, a demagogue aims to disrupt rational evaluation to prevent her audience from reflecting about whether the goal of the demagogic claim is consistent. While we may think of ourselves as perfectly rational, we all have blind spots, and in addition to logical fallacies, cognitive biases are also exploited by propaganda. One example is confirmation bias, which is when you focus on information that confirms what you already believe. Another one is cognitive dissonance, which is when you have two pieces of contradictory information at once, like an action, feeling, belief, idea, etc. Cognitive dissonance could occur in someone who believes that smoking is unhealthy but continues to smoke anyway. Or to give another example, in the book 1984 by George Orwell, the dystopian government uses the slogan, "War is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength." To explain just one last cognitive bias used in propaganda, consider stereotypes based on preconceived notions of someone's ethnicity, gender, or other false priors. During World War II, the US used very stereotyped, frankly racist images of their enemies in propaganda posters. Today, stereotyped ideas are exploited by politicians with dog whistles, meaning terms that implicitly carry a racist meaning. Stanley gives the example of the word welfare, taking on a racist connotation when used by conservative politicians in the US. Propaganda has always exploited the fact that politics can be divisive, but major shifts in our society have led to more extreme outcomes. So here's what you can do to avoid misinformation. There's no perfect solution, but the best thing you can do is to diversify your sources of news. Monmouth University created an excellent guide on media literacy and misinformation that I'll link in the description. But here's a few key highlights. Make sure you're reading a credible source of information. If you're not familiar with it, check the About page and try Googling the website and fake. If you see a comment in a discussion forum with new information that makes you feel a strong emotion, make sure they give a source and that it isn't just made up information. Try and get out of the filter bubble where you only see news from sites that confirm your current beliefs. I know it's probably uncomfortable to hear the opposing opinion, but it's very important. If you only see news that makes you feel strong emotions like anger, then that could be another sign that you're trapped in a filter bubble. Getting a variety of viewpoints from credible sources has never been easier, and a great way to do that is with Ground News. Ground News aggregates over 50,000 media sources in one place, showing you almost every news outlet covering breaking stories from all around the world. For each story, you get a visual breakdown of the political bias of the outlets reporting on it, who owns each entity, and the factuality rating of each source. You can scroll through to compare headlines and click in to read each article from its original source. One feature I also reference often is the blind spot page that shows stories that are being over or underreported by the left or the right sides. And if you're thinking you're not someone who is easily influenced by political bias, you can see for yourself with the My News Bias feature that analyzes the articles you consume to show for yourself. Ground News is on a mission to bring transparency to the media and allow readers to think for themselves. The app and website have certainly been a great tool in my toolbox to broaden my perspective. And by going to ground.news/OBF or clicking the link in the description, you can come out of your media bubble as well. Thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Alright, so in the future, these tips will be more important than ever. Text generated by AI could empower troll farms to create content on a never before seen level. According to a report by RAND Corporation's National Security Research Division, so-called deepfake images could fool millions into believing a fake video of a public figure is real. For now, the technology is possible to spot with the naked eye, but the report highlights the currently bigger threat of shallow fakes, like this video of Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, which was digitally edited to make her speech look slurred.
And then he had a press conference in the Rose Garden.
These kinds of propaganda are why it's important to stay skeptical if you see something that seems too good to be true, even if you agree with the underlying message. And a much bigger threat than deepfakes are fake democracies, or countries that act like democracies, but as Stanley put it, the vocabulary of liberal democracy is used to mask an undemocratic reality. This is now the case in Russia, where there are no longer fair elections, and any serious opposition candidates are barred from running or jailed. In Hungary, the elections are still free, but the ruling power of Viktor Orban has unfair advantages that set him up for another win last year. In fact, his main opponent was only given 5 minutes of airtime on public TV, while Orban has control of public and most private news outlets in the country. Orban's party runs fear-based campaigns with propaganda like this 2019 billboard claiming then EU President Jean-Claude Juncker and billionaire George Soros were plotting to force Hungary to accept migrants. George Soros, a Holocaust survivor and Hungarian-American billionaire, is often used as a scapegoat by Orban, using conspiracy theories with anti-Semitic undertones. And while Hungary stands out as an undemocratic member of the EU, it's not the only country that's less democratic than it seems. As Stanley points out, the two-party identities in US politics make Americans blind to the essential similarities between the agendas of the two parties. This fact was exploited by Soviet propaganda, as we can see in this poster, which caricatures the two parties as being wind-up toys with the same key: money. The point that the poster makes may be valid, but it also relies on the flawed ideology of the Soviet Union and ignores the fact that the USSR only had one political party. You could categorize the argument used in the poster as whataboutism, meaning responding to an accusation of wrongdoing by claiming that an offense committed by another is similar or worse. To give a counterexample, look at this political cartoon from the US from the same period, which makes light of food shortages in a communist system. The flawed ideology in this cartoon is mocking Soviet food shortages while ignoring the problem of poverty and hunger in the United States. Political cartoons have long been a place where propagandistic arguments are used, and today memes are in many ways their successor as a propaganda tool. While memes are an incredibly diverse topic that can be found in all sorts of places, it's well documented that alt-right groups have used edgy memes to extremist, misogynistic, or racist ideologies. I'm not saying that all or even most memes are propaganda, but I just want to point out that they have been used for propaganda purposes. And far-right groups are far from the only ones to exploit meme culture and social media to radicalize people. The so-called Islamic State, an extremist terrorist organization, has used Twitter to post memes, videos, and other messages to recruit followers to their ideology. They only moved away from Twitter after they started losing territory, thus undermining their message of strength, and Twitter cracked down on ISIS-related users and bot accounts. But the way they exploited social media is chilling, to say the least. According to Commanding the Trend, Social Media as Information Warfare, a report by Lieutenant Jared Pryor, ISIS turned social media into a weapon for terrorism. They would hijack trending topics on Twitter by adding hashtags like World Cup 2014 to their propaganda tweets, spread by their bots and their true believers. And sometimes the platforms themselves can be reason for concern. According to a recent article in Forbes, TikTok has a secret heating function where the platform can artificially promote content and boost views of a specific video. While the feature is reportedly used for promoting the content of influencers who have deals with the platform, there is concern that its China-based parent company, ByteDance, might use it to promote pro-China content. Considering that company executives have admitted to censoring critical videos in the past, it wouldn't be unprecedented. So with so much false information floating around the internet, what can we do to stay uninfluenced by misinformation? Aside from using a variety of sources, it's important to stay skeptical. Take everything you see with a grain of salt, especially if it sounds too good to be true. Maybe try and watch the news from the opposing standpoint. Also, remember that, at least for now, what you read and even what you watch is written by humans who are flawed creatures. We all have biases that shape our worldview, and that includes journalists and me, even if we aim to be impartial and follow strict ethical guidelines. But let me know in the comments if you have any other ideas to combat misinformation online. But that's it for this video. We worked really hard on this, and I don't ever ask for this, but if you like the video, hit the subscribe button. It helps us a lot. So if you wouldn't mind, that would be really appreciated. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.